So how's everybody doing today? It's good to see all of you. It's been a while since I've been here in person. It's nice that we can finally start getting together again, at least in relatively small groups. Today we're going to be talking about a fascinating topic from early American history. We're going to be talking about one of the kind of cornerstones of what we consider American society, talking about one of the most important rights that we have here as Americans. Now, as I was about to start talking, I looked at my screen over here and I had the realization that there's that old saying that you're not supposed to talk about politics and religion at a dinner party. Well, we're throwing that out the window today because we're going to be talking about politics and religion. So hold on to your seats. We are going to jump into the story of religion in early America, talking about dissenters, talking about nonconformists, and religious freedom in the pre-United States period. Religious freedom is one of those rights, one of those freedoms that we certainly take for granted in the United States. You can just drive around town here and you see numerous churches, other houses of worship, some people who don't worship at all. And all of that is perfectly acceptable in our society. Why? Partly because of the story we're going to jump into this afternoon. So let's get into it. Let's talk about these dissenters and nonconformists. Now, in order to understand the story of religion in the early United States or in early America, we do have to kind of take a look at the religious situation in Europe. And that's because many of the earliest settlers of this region came from different parts of Europe. So if we were to look at what was going on in Europe in the 16th and in the 17th century, well, what is going on in Europe during that time period in terms of religion? The Reformation. The Reformation begins in the early 16th century. Some monk named Luther goes and tacks up a list of complaints about the church. He hangs it up publicly in a small German town. That actually happened, I think the anniversary of that was last week. And that list of complaints, that action by Martin Luther sparks what comes to be called the Reformation or the Protestant Reformation. And it is a movement across Europe, particularly Western Europe, but broadly across Europe, that sought to change and reform the church. Hence the name, the Reformation. So we see in the 16th, in the 17th century, all sorts of new religious sects growing up, springing up in various parts of Europe. The map over here on the left, with all of those different colors and those stripes, kind of highlights that religious difference, that religious variety in Europe. Now, it is important to note that when we are talking about religious diversity in Western Europe, or in Europe in general, and when we are talking about religious diversity in early America, the diversity is basically different flavors of Christianity. By and large, most of the population in Europe, most of the population that makes its way to what are eventually the British colonies, do come from this Christian European background. Now, that is not exclusive. There are other religions there. Of course, there's a sizable number of Jews in Europe who will eventually make their way to North America. And when we start talking about North America, there are other religions to consider, and I'll talk about those a little bit at the end. But by and large, we're really going to be looking at different sects of Christianity when telling this story of religious diversity in early America. So the Reformation, the result of the Reformation is that you have all of these new different ideas about Christianity, about the Christian faith that spring up across Europe. And because everybody is totally tolerant and nobody really gets upset about religion, things go smoothly, right? No. What ends up happening across the European continent, really from the middle of the 16th century all the way into the 17th and even the 18th century, is that you have religious wars that break out across the continent, where Christians are killing Protestants and Protestants are killing Christians, and Lutherans and Anabaptists are fighting against each other. And you have scenes like this that we see here on the right, all sorts of elaborate and kind of traumatic tortures that are meted out by one person on another or one group on another. So this religious situation in Europe during this time period of the 16th and 17th century is complex, It is destructive, it is violent, and it is very much a cause of division across the European continent. And if we were to focus in on this area right over here, the British Isles, that religious story is still complex. Now, it's not as messy as in other parts of Europe, but there certainly is religious turmoil in England and in Scotland. How many of you know of Henry VIII? What is Henry VIII famous for? His wives. He only kills 2 of them. For his wives. He has 6 wives. And Henry, his first wife, is Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon is a Spanish princess. She is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. They're the ones who send Columbus across the ocean. So she is a tremendously significant figure in European politics. She's a prize bride, if you will. In fact, she was married to Henry's older brother at first, but Arthur, the prince, dies, and then she gets married to the younger brother, Henry. And Henry and Catherine of Aragon have a fairly long marriage, fairly prosperous marriage, but there's a problem. Well, they don't have a son. They do have a daughter. Her name is Mary. But Henry and Catherine of Aragon do not produce a son. Now, what is something that a king needs to do? But produce an heir. And what's the easiest way to have an heir but to have a son? So Henry is really disappointed that his wife hasn't given him a son. He doesn't know much about biology because who determines the gender of a child? It's him, but that's neither here nor there. And he is kind of pulling away from his wife of many years. There's another factor that helps him pull away, and that's the fact that his eye lands on a pretty vivacious, energetic girl at court named Anne Boleyn. So Henry wants to marry Anne Boleyn, but he can't marry Anne Boleyn because he's still married to Catherine of Aragon. He wants a divorce. He needs that marriage kind of gotten away with. Well, who can grant the king a divorce? The Pope. So Henry writes a letter to the Pope and says, hey, I need a divorce from my wife. And the Pope basically says, can't do that, sorry. So what does Henry do?
Divorces her anyway.
He divorces her anyway. He basically says, well, I'm not going to listen to the Pope anymore. I'm establishing my own church. We'll call it the Church of England, and I, the king, will be the head of the church. Now that I'm the head of the church, I'm going to have my ministers arrange a divorce. We're going to shove Catherine of Aragon and my daughter Mary off into a nice castle in the countryside of England, and we'll forget about her, and I'll go marry Anne Boleyn, and things will be great. Doesn't really work out that way, particularly for Anne Boleyn, but what we see with Henry VIII is the coming of the Reformation to England. Around 1535, 1536 or thereabout, England becomes a Protestant nation. The Church of England, the Anglican Church, becomes the state church of England. Now, there were many people in England who had a problem with the Anglican Church. And the big problem that they had was that the Anglican Church was essentially Catholicism light. In terms of the hymns used, in terms of the prayers said, in terms of the church structure, it was pretty similar to Rome, just that we've replaced the Pope with the King. So what we see emerging in England during this time period, the latter part of the 16th century, is a movement to clean up the Anglican Church, to, if you will, purify the Anglican Church. Those dissenters who want to purify the Anglican Church are soon called Puritans. And the Puritans follow the teachings of a European reformer by the name of John Calvin. So Calvinism makes its way into England by way of the Puritans. Calvinism also has a stronghold here in Scotland. Scottish Calvinism is called Presbyterianism. So the Presbyterians are Calvinists, the Puritans are Calvinists, the Huguenots in France are Calvinists. Calvinist theology is pretty important. It's basically probably the dominant Protestant group during this time period, even surpassing Luther in influence by the time we get to the latter part of the 16th century. In any case, in England, these Puritans, these Calvinists are viewed as troublemakers. They are viewed as questioning the authority of the monarch because They want to clean up the church. They want to purify the church. They want to reform the church even further. So what we begin to see is religious struggles between the Anglican state church and the Puritan church, the Calvinists. There is animosity between the two groups. And the Anglicans begin to persecute, to a degree, the Puritans. And there's really this tension between those groups. Now, among the Puritans, there was a group that was even more radical in terms of reform. These more radical Puritans were separatists. They wanted to entirely break away from the Church of England. The Puritans wanted to reform the church from within. The separatists wanted to tear the entire thing down and start over. Now, the separatists were a small group, population-wise, but they were really viewed as a little bit too extreme by everybody else. So these separatists are even more roundly persecuted. And in fact, many of these separatists decide they can't practice their religion freely in England, so they have to go someplace else. And where do they go? But Holland, exactly. They go to the Netherlands. And they kind of live in the Dutch cities, places like Amsterdam, and they practice their religion freely there. The separatists, a large group of them, are in the Netherlands for about a decade. But they start to grow uncomfortable there. Not because of religious persecution, but because most of these people were farmers. They had been in the English countryside, and now they're living in these urban settings. They don't really fit into Dutch society. They don't really speak Dutch. They're kind of doing the menial labor in the Dutch cities, so it's not really economically satisfying. Sure, they're practicing their religion freely, but there's another problem. By this point, a lot of those separatist children are growing up in Dutch cities, and they are speaking Dutch, and they are adopting Dutch fashions, and they are enjoying the good life in the Netherlands. And that, to these English parents, was terrifying because their children were becoming Dutch. They were forgetting their English origins. So what do we do? What do these separatists do? They decide they have to leave the Netherlands. So they go back to England, but England isn't really a viable solution because they face persecution there. So they ask the king, this time James I, for permission to go west, to go to North America. The English had established a colony in Virginia in 1607, Jamestown, and it begins to grow by the early 16-teens. So these English separatists decide, we're going to go to Virginia and establish a religious outpost there, a place where we can practice our religion free from persecution. So in 1620, the separatists rent a couple of boats and they sail out of Plymouth, England. Now, by the time they make it out of the harbor, one of the boats begins to sink. It has all these leaks in it, so they have to turn around and go back to the harbor, and then everybody gets onto the other boat that's a little bit more seaworthy. That boat is called the Mayflower. And you have this group of separatists, about 100 or so, sailing across the Atlantic Ocean on board the Mayflower. They eventually arrive in North America, but they kind of got lost along the way, because they don't end up in Virginia. They end up a few hundred miles north of Virginia. In fact, when the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, as they come to be called, first make landfall in North America, where are they? Cape Cod, in Provincetown. So a bunch of them get off the boat, they go to Provincetown, they see the sand dunes, they watch the sunset, they say, wow, this is really nice, but it probably gets really crowded in the summertime. You know, there's all those boutique shops and tourists. So they get back on the Mayflower and they start to head south to Virginia again. But there's a storm that whips up, so the captain of the Mayflower turns the ship around, goes across Massachusetts Bay, and dumps the passengers of the Mayflower at a place that they christen as Plymouth. And there in 1620, all of the Pilgrims, men, women, and children, step off the boat one by one and walk across a rock somebody conveniently chisels a date into. That does not happen. Not to burst the bubble for the people at Plymouth, but the story of Plymouth Rock is completely made up. It was made up in the early 19th century as a way of drawing tourists to Plymouth. It has worked. Plymouth Rock is a tremendously disappointing tourist trap. Don't send this to Plymouth, please. In any case, the Pilgrims show up And they set up their little settlement of Plymouth Plantation, and they do so that they can practice their religion freely. They want to be free from religious persecution. So it's often said that the Pilgrims come here for religious freedom. But is that actually the full story? No, because they didn't want anybody else to practice their religion. They were just here for their own religious freedom. If you were, let's say, Catholic and showed up at Plymouth, would you be welcome there? No. You would have been chased out of town. So the Pilgrims show up to practice their own religion freely. Well, a decade later, or over the course of the 1620s going into 1630, more and more English separatists, English nonconformists begin to make their way across the Atlantic Ocean to North America. And many of them settle in the area around Boston, around Salem. Salem is established in 1626 or 23 or something like that. Many of these new settlers are Puritans, those people that wanted to reform the church from within. They come to North America to escape the persecution they were feeling from the Anglicans in England. So they come, again, for religious freedom, sort of. They come to practice their religion freely. Again, the Puritans weren't embracing everybody. They were looking for their co-religionists, the people with the same beliefs, to establish colonies and outposts here in what eventually gets called New England. Now, the beginning of this migration across the Atlantic Ocean from England of these Puritans is in the 1620s. And in fact, it lasts for about 20 years until about the 1640s. And it is sometimes termed by historians as the Great Migration. Or the Great Puritan Migration. There's lots of different great migrations in history. This is a movement of Puritans from England to all different parts of the New World. The predominant number end up here in New England, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony, eventually establishing the Connecticut Colony, kind of getting involved in Rhode Island. We'll talk about the special circumstances of Rhode Island later on. Some end up in the Chesapeake Bay, particularly Maryland, and we'll talk about that story in a second. And many actually go to the islands of the Caribbean, places like Barbados, for example. And what are they doing in the islands of the Caribbean? They make rum. Rum, which is a tremendously important commodity that is kind of one of the things that lubricates the transatlantic trade. Rum is hugely important. So we see this great migration of Puritans leaving England, escaping religious persecution there, and establishing religious outposts here in the New World, particularly in New England and a few in the Chesapeake Bay. Now, the important figure in the beginnings of this great migration is a man named John Winthrop. I'm sure most of you have heard of John Winthrop. There's a town named after him in Massachusetts because he was really the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was a Puritan minister in England who leads his congregation on this trek across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1630, Winthrop and his followers, on board a ship called the Arbella, make that treacherous journey across the North Atlantic, arrive in what is today Charlestown, Massachusetts, and set up a little settlement there. They're only in Charlestown for a short time. They decide they'd prefer it on the other side of the Charles River, so they then move to the Shawmut Peninsula, which is today's Boston. They establish Boston in around 1630. Now, when Winthrop brings his congregation to the New World, as they are about to settle here in Massachusetts and establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he preaches a sermon to his followers. The sermon is called A Model of Christian Charity. But the kind of most memorable part of this sermon is what we see right here on the screen. He says, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." The idea of the city upon a hill, one of the kind of nicknames of Boston, when we think about it. Boston was established by Winthrop, by his followers, for a godly purpose. They were going to set up a Christian commonwealth here in New England in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, I guess we can kind of get the current or the attitude of Boston itself. The idea of Boston being the hub of the universe and the American Athens. Boston has always had a high opinion of itself, going right back to its founding, being that city on a hill. We have a godly purpose. And what Winthrop and his followers wanted to do was to ensure that that godly purpose was followed, that Massachusetts Bay, that Boston, does become this example of Christian charity, this example of Christian settlement in the New World, a place where Puritans could practice their religion freely. There is kind of a hidden thing going on with this, though. If we are a godly community, then who should have the power in that community? Who should be the one leading it? Should it be the politicians, the soldiers, or should it be the preachers and the ministers? What we see in Massachusetts is that the church and the state are essentially one and the same. What Winthrop and the Puritans are setting up in the Massachusetts Bay Colony is essentially a theocracy, rule by religious leaders. So we celebrate the arrival of the Puritans, and we talk about how they came here for religious freedom. But again, it was religious freedom for themselves, not for others. And this very quickly starts to cause some controversy in the Massachusetts Bay. Within years, within months of Winthrop arriving, many other Puritans make their way to Massachusetts Bay. Other settlements are established outside of Boston, but Boston really is the hub of all the activity in New England. And we see religious controversy springing up. One figure who causes problems for Winthrop and for Massachusetts Bay is another Puritan minister by the name of Roger Williams. You may have heard of Roger Williams. He comes to New England. He preaches for a time in Boston. He preaches for a time in Salem. He's the minister of a church. But he comes back to Boston, and here in Boston, he gets in trouble with the authorities. Why does Roger Williams get in trouble with the authorities in Massachusetts? Well, he questions the relationship between church and state. He says, should the ministers really be the ones passing civil law? Should the church and state be so closely intertwined? Well, guess what happens to Roger Williams? He gets in trouble with the authorities. They don't like what he's saying. They don't like what he's preaching. So he is exiled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and sent to the worst place imaginable. I don't even have to say it. You all know, right? Rhode Island. He is sent to Rhode Island. So he sets off in the middle of winter in 1635, leaving Massachusetts Bay Colony, heading down I-95 toward Rhode Island. And along the way, he makes the acquaintance of the Narragansetts. Now, the Narragansetts were the native peoples in Rhode Island. They controlled much of that territory. And Roger Williams befriends the Narragansetts and establishes a pretty warm relationship with them, a cordial relationship, we should say. The Narragansetts help Roger Williams survive and help him or grant him land. He purchases land. He signs a treaty for land from the Narragansetts. And there we have the origins of what comes to be called the Providence Plantation. Now, because Roger Williams is kicked out of Massachusetts because of his ideas about church and state, when Providence Plantation is established, one of the key ideas that Williams brings there is religious toleration. Basically, it was the idea that you don't have to be a Puritan to live here. You can practice whatever faith you want. As long as you are following the civil laws, you will be left alone, and you have the right to worship as you see fit. So when we think about religious freedom in the United States, the place where that really begins isn't Plymouth, it isn't Boston, it's in Rhode Island. Now, within a couple of years, another figure is exiled from Massachusetts. This time, it's a woman by the name of Anne Hutchinson. Now, why does Anne Hutchinson get in trouble with the authorities in Massachusetts and get exiled? Well, not because she was a witch. It might have even been a little bit more dangerous than that, because she was a woman who had an opinion on Scripture. She believed that women should discuss the preaching, should discuss the Bible. They could form their own opinions. A thinking woman is so dangerous. So the authorities in Massachusetts decide, you can't do that. We don't want you here. You're gone. And where is she sent? Rhode Island. She heads south and eventually makes a stop with Roger Williams. They're in Providence Plantation, but then continues southward and purchases a plot of land on what becomes Aquidneck Island, basically establishes Newport, and then is there for a short time. Other people flock to where she is with this notion of religious toleration still in play for the region. And Hutchinson's kind of trajectory post Rhode Island, however, is kind of tragic. She leaves Rhode Island in the early 1640s, I believe it is, and moves to Long Island, New York, and is killed on Long Island, New York in a Native American raid. She and her children and servants are all massacred during this raid. So she becomes this symbol of religious freedom in the United States because she questioned the religious authorities in Massachusetts. Now, several hundred years later, the authorities in Massachusetts felt kind of bad about how they treated Anne Hutchinson, and they decided to put a statue of her out in front of the State House in Boston. So you can go see the statue of Anne Hutchinson there in Boston if you would like. Now, because Rhode Island has this kind of renegade origin and this toleration of religion, it really does become a center of religious mixing, cosmopolitanism, if you will. Other groups that are persecuted in England or in other parts of North America make their way to Rhode Island. You have Quakers that show up there, you have Baptists that show up there, and you have a Jewish population that settles in Newport. In fact, what we see in Newport is really the first concentrated Jewish community in English America. There were numerous Jews in New Amsterdam when it was a Dutch colony. The Dutch were very tolerant of all religions. The Dutch were really only looking for business. The English, of course, were very different. Religion played a large role in English colonization. So what we see in Newport is the first Jewish congregation established in British America, and the first Jewish house of worship, the Truro Synagogue, is established. The building there today was built in around 1760, but it does represent the achievements of the Jewish community that was there in Newport from the colonial period, the earlier colonial period. One of the important things about Rhode Island and the concept of religious freedom is that idea does get enshrined in the original royal charter for the establishment of Rhode Island and Providence Plantation. When Roger Williams set up Providence Plantation, he wasn't doing it with any authority from the crown, with any authority from England. But by the 1660s, Rhode Island has been granted an official charter from King Charles II. Rhode Island now has legal standing as an official colony of England. And in that charter, we have this portion right there, that segment, that guarantees religious freedom. I'll read that to you so I don't have to strain your eyes. The charter says that our royal will and pleasure is that no person within the said colony at any time hereafter shall be in any wise molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences in opinion in matters of religion, and do not actually disturb the civil peace of our said colony. But that all and every person and persons may from time to time and at all times hereafter freely and fully have and enjoy his and their own judgments and consciences in matters of religious concernments throughout the tract of land hereafter mentioned. There we have religious freedom in British North or English North America, there in the Charter of Rhode Island. Now, it is important to note that while the Rhode Island Charter granted people freedom of conscience, freedom of worship in the colony, there was religious toleration in the colony, citizenship in Rhode Island was tied to being either an Anglican or a Puritan. You had to be part of those two state churches in order to vote, in order to have a voice in the community. But if you weren't, you could still practice your religion freely and not worry about being persecuted. You just didn't have a say in government. So Rhode Island, in many ways, is the birthplace of this concept of religious freedom because of Roger Williams, because of Anne Hutchinson, because of that charter in 1663. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, those Puritans have begun to expand, and they are pushing westward out of Boston, establishing more and more towns. And as they push westward out of Boston, they are encountering many Native Americans. And the relationship between the English Puritans and the Native Americans is somewhat tense. At first, there's a friendly relationship, but then as more and more Englishmen show up, the relationship becomes less cordial, less friendly. There are tensions. Part of those tensions are due to the fact that the English Puritans are aggressively trying to spread religion. They are trying to spread their faith among the Native Americans. There is an organization that's established in England called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, whose goal was to, well, spread the gospel among the native peoples of North America. It was essentially a missionary society for English Puritans to spread their faith. One of the most effective of the missionaries from this Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was a guy named John Eliot. We can assume that the gentleman in black here is John Eliot. And he was really, really skilled at what he did. He does manage to have success in converting many native peoples to the Puritan religion. One of the tools that Eliot uses was a translation of the Bible. He undertook to translate the New Testament into the Algonquin language. We see a title page of it over here, which is remarkable for many reasons. One is that the Algonquin language, which was the predominant native linguistic group of of this part of North America, did not have a written language. So what we see Eliot doing is using the English alphabet to transliterate all of these words into the Algonquin language to produce this Bible so that he could then go and preach to the native peoples. Tremendous amount of work went into it, and Eliot does have a fair degree of success. He does manage to convert many native peoples to Christianity, to Puritanism. Those natives who convert are known as the Praying Indians. That's what the English called them. But the Praying Indians were kind of caught in a no-win situation. Because they had adopted English religion, and along with that English clothing and English customs, they were separated from the other Native Americans who did not convert. But because they were Native Americans, the English viewed them with suspicion. So they were caught between the English world and the native world. And in fact, they were physically in between the English and the native worlds. There are numerous Praying Indian towns that are established west of Boston that are where these converts were forced to live. Places like Hopkinton and Ashland and Natick all begin as Praying Indian communities. There's basically a semicircle of about 10 or 12 of them around Boston. So they were caught there in the middle. We see the Puritans pushing their religion, though. We'll come back to the Praying Indians in a couple of minutes. In the meantime, there were other groups in England that faced religious persecution. One of the most prominent were the Catholics. England had been Catholic until Henry decided they weren't Catholic. But there were many people in England who maintained their Catholic faith. And they were viewed with suspicion. They were viewed as disloyal to the kings. In fact, there's a assassination plot of James I in 1605, the famous gunpowder plot, which was Catholics trying to blow up the Protestant king. That doesn't help the Catholic reputation in England at all. There was this deep, deep suspicion of Catholics across England, and Catholics were persecuted. They were tortured. They lost their property. So the position of English Catholics was very, very tenuous. It was a very, very dangerous situation for many of them. Yet there were some Catholics in England who did have status, who did have some influence. And one of those, or one family of those, were the Calverts. The Calverts were a group of English noblemen, and they were Catholic. So what we see is that the Calverts begin to use their influence, use their name, use their position to encourage the king to allow the establishment of a religious haven for English Catholics in the New World. The king does eventually grant that charter to establish this colony in 1632. And the charter was originally meant to go to the first Lord Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, George Calvert, but he dies in 1632. So it's his son, Cecil, who becomes the second Baron Baltimore, who is the one who carries through with this plan to establish this Catholic colony in the New World. That colony is named Maryland, and it becomes a haven for Catholics in North America, a refuge for English Catholics to escape from the persecution they faced in England and find shelter in the New World. Now, ideally, the Calverts and the English Catholics would have prospered in Maryland. Many Catholics do make their way over, but their hold on Maryland is relatively brief, because who else shows up in the decade of the 1630s and 1640s? In Maryland, in the Chesapeake Bay region, but a lot of those Puritans. Remember, 5,000 Puritans during that Great Migration go to the Chesapeake. And when the Puritans arrive and soon outnumber the Catholics in Maryland, what do the Puritans do? But they begin to try to, well, Puritanize Maryland. So it's originally set up as a religious haven for Catholics. There is an expectation of religious toleration there. The Puritans show up, and it does kind of change the nature of the Maryland colony. The Calverts do okay, however, because in the charter, Maryland is granted as a proprietary colony, which means that the Calverts own it. So they make all the profit from owning all of this land. When they sell land to colonists, they get a nice big cut of it. Some goes to the king. The Calverts do okay controlling Maryland. But the Catholics, they end up having to struggle for their survival there, because eventually lots of Puritans show up. Now, there are other groups in England in the 17th century that are facing religious persecution because they don't fit into the main religious groups. They don't follow the Puritan faith. They're not Presbyterians in Scotland, and they're not Anglicans. So they are seen as outsiders. They are seen as nonconformists. And because they are nonconformists, they were persecuted, they were ridiculed, they were considered dangerous. One group in particular that would have a profound impact in America are the Quakers, the Society of Friends. The Quakers, the Quaker faith, is established in the middle of the 17th century by a man named George Fox. And he gives birth to, or helps create, this new faith. Now, what are some of the things about the Quakers that make them unique? Anybody know anything about the Quakers? They're pacifists. That was a big thing. They didn't believe in fighting. Their religious services were different than all the others. They didn't have a minister. They didn't have a preacher. It was a gathering, and if somebody was moved to pray or moved to say something, they stood up and they said something. Otherwise, you were contemplating in silence. The Quakers also believed in sort of gender equality. There wasn't really a separation between men and women, at least in the religious realm. They believed in treating the Native Americans fairly. So they were seen as dangerous. They were seen as outside the norm in England. They were roundly persecuted and ridiculed in England. Well, as it turns out, here we see a couple of Quaker meetings here. In England at this time, there was a prominent family, a relatively wealthy family, the Penn family, who had a son named, anybody know this son's name? William Penn. William Penn grows up really as an English cavalier, kind of tied to the Anglican Church, but he has a religious conversion and he adopts the Quaker faith and uses his family's influence to get a charter from the king to establish a haven for Quakers in the New World. That charter would eventually lead to the establishment of a new colony. We'll get to that new colony in a couple of minutes. Before William Penn arrives on the scene, however, there are Quakers who make their way to the New World. Some settle in Rhode Island, in places like Newport and Providence, where they were allowed to practice their faith as they saw fit. Some go to some parts of the southern colonies in the Chesapeake Bay. They didn't fit in so well there. And some even come to Massachusetts, and particularly Boston. Now, Boston, Massachusetts, was a Puritan-dominated town. And how do the Puritans react to the arrival of a couple of Quakers, particularly Quakers who were coming to spread their religion, Quaker missionaries? not that well. The Puritans don't really like the arrival of the Quakers. The earliest Quakers show up in Boston in the middle of the 1650s, and they are driven out of the city by 1656. They are ordered to leave. But does that stop the Quakers and other Quaker missionaries from coming to Boston and trying to spread their faith? No. And in fact, by the late 1650s, there is a group of Quaker missionaries that arrive in Boston that begin to try to spread their faith. They are ordered out of the city, out of the town by the authorities, and they refuse to leave. So what happens to them? Well, they are rounded up, they are put on trial, and they are sentenced to execution. This group of Quakers comes to be called the Boston Martyrs. In October of 1659, the 3 Boston martyrs were sentenced to hang. 2 of them meet their fate on the gallows. William Robinson and Marmaduke Stevenson are executed. The 3rd member of that group was Mary Dyer, and she's standing in line waiting for her turn to meet the gallows. But because she was a woman, the authorities take pity on her. She has watched her 2 friends die, and she's standing there awaiting her turn, and the authorities say, "We will save you. We won't hang you, but you have to leave. You have 48 hours to leave Massachusetts." And like a sensible person, what does Mary Dyer do? She leaves. She gathers up her stuff. She heads out of Massachusetts, but only for a short time. Within a couple of months, she's back, and shortly thereafter, once again, preaching and trying to spread her faith in Boston, which, of course, gets her in trouble with the authorities, who this time don't show mercy to her. And in June of 1660, she too is hanged in the center of Boston. So we see among the Puritans a clear example of lack of religious toleration. And in fact, you could even call this religious persecution. The Quakers were not welcome. They were persecuted in England, ridiculed in England. The ones that come over to North America, to Boston, meet this type of fate. So the situation for the Quakers was really, really tough. Where could they go? What could they do to find a place where they could practice their religion freely? Well, that is where William Penn enters into our story. As I said, Penn was from a prominent, wealthy family, has this religious conversion, uses his family connections to get permission from the king to establish a haven for Quakers in the New World. He is granted title to all of this land. The new colony, which will be called Pennsylvania, named after the Penn family, is a proprietary colony for the Penn family, meaning they essentially own it. They make all the profit from it. Everything goes through them. The Penn family will own Pennsylvania until the American Revolution. So for about 100 years, it is a proprietary colony. And William Penn and his fellow Quakers, a group of his fellow Quakers, come over to North America and begin setting up their colony. One of the first things that Penn does when he arrives in what becomes Pennsylvania on the banks of the Delaware River is he signs a treaty with the local native peoples, the Delaware peoples. It's called the Great Treaty of 1682. And, essentially he forms a friendship with them, purchases a plot of land, and there lays out the city of Philadelphia. So what we see is that Philadelphia and Pennsylvania begin as a place where Quakers could find shelter from religious persecution in England and in the other English colonies. Now, because of the pacifism, because of the open-mindedness of the Quakers, Pennsylvania quickly becomes a multi-faith territory. Lots of people that are persecuted in other parts of North America and other parts of Europe descend on Pennsylvania because there was religious toleration there, because it was established by the Quakers. So Pennsylvania, in many ways, will become a center of religious diversity in early America. We'll talk about some of those groups in a couple of minutes. Meanwhile, back in New England, the situation is growing more tense. We have the execution of Quakers in the 1650s and 1660s. We have John Eliot and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospels going out and trying to convert the native peoples. By this point, by the 1660s and 1670s, the Anglicans have begun to make inroads into Massachusetts. After all, the Anglican Church is the state church of England. The king is the head of the Anglican Church, so we see some Anglicans showing up in Boston. For the most part, the small population of Anglicans tried to stay out of the way and keep their heads down and not cause any ripples in Puritan society, because things don't work out well if you cause turmoil among the Puritans. So though there are Anglicans in Boston, they really aren't a notable segment of society, at least at this point. But we do see tensions springing up in New England society. By the time we get to the 1670s, there is tension between the native peoples, the English, and the English and the native peoples. Tension that is based on the English incursions into native lands, the spread of English culture, the fact that English animals, the farm animals, are destroying Native American crops. All of these tensions will eventually explode into war. King Philip's War. So what we see in the late 1600s is open warfare between the native peoples and the English. The natives, led by King Philip, who we see in this cartoon over here, in this drawing over here, whose name was actually Metacom. The English called him King Philip. He was the son of Massasoit, the Wampanoag chieftain who helped the Pilgrims in 1620, who helped them to survive. So there's a long relationship between the Wampanoags and the English. Here in the 1670s, Philip and his followers are fighting against the English, trying to preserve their way of life. King Philip's War would end up being the costliest war in American history, and the bloodiest war in American history in terms of per capita casualties. Now, there wasn't a large population at that time. Obviously, the American Civil War is the bloodiest war in our history, but per capita, King Philip's War was. And it was one of the most destructive wars in our history because of the loss of life, because of the loss of property, because of the destruction of many of the English towns that had been established. Places like Seekonk and Providence are completely destroyed during King Philip's War. They are burned to the ground. It was really a bloody, destructive conflict. The end result of King Philip's War, however, is that the English are victorious and Native American power in New England is essentially destroyed. The English are now free to do whatever they want in New England, more or less. That episode of King Philip's War is followed relatively shortly thereafter by a political change in England. In 1685, Charles II, the King of England, the guy who had issued a lot of charters to these English colonies, dies. And he's succeeded by his brother, who was the Duke of York, who now becomes King James II. James II was disliked by the English populace. And there was one big problem that the English had with James II. Anybody want to take a guess what that is?
He was gay?
Not that he was gay. It was even worse. He was Catholic. He was Catholic. His wife was Catholic, and he was a closet Catholic. He didn't publicly say it, but everybody knew that he was Catholic. And that did not sit well with the English population, with the English populace, with English Parliament. So James II becomes a tremendously unpopular king in England. One of the things that James II tries to do is to assert more direct control over the colonies. For much of the 17th century, the colonies were free to do what they wanted. You know, Parliament was passing laws, but the colonies were kind of like, maybe we'll follow those laws, maybe we won't. But when James II comes to the throne, he decides to try to implement direct control. And he does so by revoking the charters of all of the New England colonies, because he wants to create one super colony. I don't think that was the term for it, but I'm going to call it a super colony, that he called the Dominion of New England. The Dominion of New England was supposed to be a conglomeration of the New England colonies, parts of New York and part of New Jersey. And it was all going to be put under the control of a royal appointed governor. The person that James II sends to New England is a man named Edmund Andros. That's Edmund Andros over there. Andros comes to North America to take control of this new dominion of New England. And one of the things he does, he goes from colony to colony and physically takes their charters away. So he goes to Boston, takes the Massachusetts charter, goes to Providence, takes the Providence charter. He goes to Hartford to try to take the Connecticut charter, but the people in Connecticut hide it in an old oak tree and it's never taken away. It's a point of pride for the people in Connecticut. But Andros doesn't need the physical charter because he has royal authority, so he tries to establish this dominion of New England. Andros was an Anglican. And when he arrives in Boston, he basically tries to do everything he can to annoy the Puritans. He has an Anglican church built in Boston. Today's King's Chapel comes from that. He also allows the public celebration of Christmas in Boston. Now, the Puritans did not celebrate Christmas. They believed that there was no biblical basis for a celebration of Christmas. It doesn't give a date anywhere in the Bible. But the Anglicans loved Christmas. They loved to celebrate. They got out in the streets and played games and drank beer and cider and had a really good time. And the Puritans didn't want any of that. So here comes Andros. He takes control of New England and allows Anglicans to celebrate Christmas, which means that we now are partying in the streets when we should really be at work, because that's what the Puritans like to do, offending the Puritan majority in New England. So Andros does all he can to really annoy the New Englanders and to assert his royal authority. Well, what happens? Over in England in 1688, James II is essentially forced to flee the country because there's so much popular displeasure with him. He flees to France. And when he leaves the country, Parliament declares that he has abdicated the throne, and they invite William of Orange and Mary Stuart to come and take the throne of England to rule or to reign as joint monarchs, William and Mary. That event is known as the Glorious Revolution, and it is a relatively peaceful transfer of power from James II to William and Mary. Now, James II and his descendants will claim that there was no legitimate reason for William and Mary to be the king or queen of England, and they will fight a protracted war against the successors of William and Mary. But James II is out of power. When James leaves, when he is chased out of power, the Dominion of New England falls apart. Edmund Andros is recalled back to England. The charters are reissued for the colonies. The Plymouth colony disappears at that point. It is merged with Massachusetts. And basically this experiment in direct control over New England, at least temporarily, has come to an end. Now, what happens to Edmund Andros? Anybody care? He's at first imprisoned in Boston. When James II leaves his throne, Edmund Andros is imprisoned. This event called Andros Rebellion, but he's soon shipped back to England. In England, he's kind of rehabilitated, and then he's sent to one of the islands in the Caribbean, I can't remember which one, where he takes over as royal governor there. So he lands on his feet. We don't need to worry too much about Edmund Andros. In any case, all of this turmoil with King Phillips War, with the Dominion of New England, has religion as its basis. And all of this turmoil, this social upheaval, this political upheaval, this religious tension will eventually explode in 1692 in Salem. Now, what happens in Salem in 1692? That. The witch trials, the witch hysteria. There are lots of reasons why the witch hysteria breaks out in Salem, but the social tensions of the preceding decades certainly are fundamental to understanding what happens in Salem and why we have this hysteria and these trials and these executions that occur in that city. Now, incidentally, the Salem witch trials were not the first witch trials in New England. Those actually occurred in Connecticut about 50 years earlier, in the late 1640s. But the Salem ones are certainly the most celebrated and the most famous. And last weekend in Salem was probably insane, as every Halloween usually is. But this is kind of a symptom of the religious turmoil, the religious upheaval that is occurring in New England during the latter part of the 17th century. This religious turmoil really is exacerbated, is made worse, or expanded upon by some of the prominent preachers of the day. Those Puritan ministers who are looking at the social situation in New England and seeing, we're failing in our mission. Remember, John Winthrop set us up as a godly society, that city on the hill. Does this reflect the city on the hill, or does this reflect the failings of the city on the hill? One of the voices most prominent in this was a guy named Cotton Mather. How many of you have heard of Cotton Mather? Good old Cotton Mather. He was certainly one of the important figures in the story of the Salem witch trials, and even after the witch trials end, he was a firm believer that things were afoot in Salem. In fact, in 1793, he writes a book that's called Wonders of the Invisible World. It was essentially a defense of the witch trials, the witch hysteria, and the execution of witches in Salem. He says, "The devil is now making one attempt more upon us. An army of devils is horribly broke in upon the place which is the center, and after a sort, the firstborn of our English settlements. And the houses of the good people there are filled with the doleful shrieks of their children and servants, tormented by invisible hands with tortures altogether preternatural." So he's pretty sure that the devil is at play, that we are no longer serving that godly purpose, that perhaps we have fallen away from we're not as good as our ancestors were, basically. He becomes a proponent of an idea called declension. Declension was the idea that our grandfathers were more upright, were more moral than we are, and we have fallen away from what they have done. We are not reaching the heights that they have. We have become a society of sinners. We are no longer the godly society. This idea of declension really is embraced by a lot of Puritan ministers at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century to try to explain the social changes that have occurred in New England, in North America in general. And it is an important idea that Cotton Mather does espouse and that he does put forward. Now, that idea of a religious decline, it sounds like there's a bird chirping in here somewhere. That idea of a religious decline and the idea of the need for kind of a revitalization of religion does in many ways lay the groundwork for a religious revival that will begin in the 1730s, a movement that comes to be called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is actually a movement that begins in England as a series of religious revivals, but makes its way across the Atlantic Ocean to New England and then to the rest of the American colonies. And it was this idea that a new spirituality was needed. One of the things that leads to the Great Awakening was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a philosophical movement in the late 17th, early 18th century that focused on rationality, that focused on knowledge as our way of understanding. And one of the ideas of the Enlightenment was that we can only know things that we can see, only know things that are concrete, really calling into question a lot of the basis of religion. So the Great Awakening is a reaction to that. And it is a religious revival that does spread across the Atlantic Ocean from Britain to North America. And here in North America, it becomes a significant factor in the growth of new sects, new religions in the British colonies. The machinery of the Great Awakening, if you will, were the charismatic preachers that went and talked to large crowds. And one of the first important ministers and preachers of the Great Awakening was a man named Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was a very distinguished New England minister, well-known, well-regarded, who was really a believer in faith as the key to salvation. He believed that God would save us if we were upright, if we were faithful enough. That idea of faith in salvation is really key to Edwards' preaching. But to get to that point, to get to that message, he often used, frankly, terrifying imagery. What you see on the screen is an excerpt from his most famous sermon called "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And what Edwards was doing with his sermons was trying to create an emotional response in his listeners, trying to rile up the people hearing his words so that he could then bring it all around to this idea of salvation. So I'm going to read you this excerpt and kind of imagine that you're in a New England church listening to this preacher yelling at you from the pulpit. He says, "Your wickedness makes you, as it were, heavy as lead, and to tend downward with great weight and pressure towards hell. And if God should let you go, you would immediately sink and swiftly descend and plunge into the bottomless gulf. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you, and is dreadfully, he probably doesn't stumble over his words, and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath toward you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times so abominable in his eyes as the most hateful venomous serpent is in ours." Anybody have an emotional response there? You can imagine the terror, the fear, the anguish that his listeners get from these sermons, and how he can then jump from this to the idea of salvation, to the idea that you can be saved with faith in God. So Jonathan Edwards, in many ways, is a prototypical Great Awakening preacher, because he does prey on the emotions. He does use that emotional response of his listeners. He certainly, however, was not the only one. Another prominent preacher during the Great Awakening was George Whitefield. Whitefield was an Englishman who comes to the colonies and travels throughout the 13 English colonies preaching and spreading his religious message. Now, he emerged as somewhat of a rock star of his day. Everywhere he went, he was greeted by enthusiastic crowds, sometimes 10, 20, 30,000 listeners. He often had to give his sermons out in the countryside or out in the woods, because there weren't places big enough in the towns and in the cities for these crowds to gather. And his preaching was tremendously dramatic, tremendously charismatic. His actions, as we see depicted in both of these images, were theatrical, with his arms raised or his hands dangling out over the congregation as if he was mesmerizing his listeners. He drew people in to hear his message. And he was tremendously effective in sparking this religious revival and in continuing this religious revival across North America. Now, one of the things to consider about George Whitefield and other ministers and preachers like this is that though their appearance in a town was an event and everybody went to that event, not everybody was necessarily buying what he was selling. And in fact, if we look at this image over here we have the preacher dramatically posed. And here we have some of his rapt listeners over here. She doesn't seem too interested in what he's saying, right? And what about this guy? He's just there for the free beer. So, there was tremendous success with many of these ministers, but they also did meet some resistance. Sometimes subtle resistance, like reading your books, sometimes more belligerent resistance, like the guy with his beer. But the effect of these preachers, these ministers going out across North America was significant, because it does revitalize religion. It does lead to this great awakening, this this kind of explosion of religious sentiment in North America. So what are some of the important impacts of the Great Awakening? We're going to go through this real quick. One is that it upset traditional religious establishments. The ministers and preachers were generally from outside of the established congregations. So you had a lot of non-Puritan ministers and preachers in New England, and non-Anglican preachers down in Virginia and in parts of the South. So it challenged the authority of the established churches. It caused a rift between the so-called old lights, the traditionalists, and the new lights, those who wanted to re-energize and go in a different direction with faith. It focused on a personal experience of religion. It was me and God. I don't need any of this other stuff. I don't need the ministers. I don't need the church, because religion is a personal experience. And it defended the individual's rights to dissent. I don't have to agree with what the minister is saying, because I have my own idea of what faith is and my relationship with the deity. It leads to the growth of new churches in North America. Things like groups like the Methodists and the Baptists really expand dramatically. as a result of the Great Awakening. And it spurred the establishment of numerous educational institutions. New colleges are established. Places like Dartmouth, Brown, Princeton, and Rutgers are all set up to train new ministers and preachers as a result of this religious revival. And in a way, it leads to the democratization of religion in America, because it wasn't just one group that was in charge now. Everybody could have an opinion on religion, and everybody's opinion was as valid as anybody else's. So that is an important aspect of the Great Awakening. The success of the Great Awakening and the ideas of religious toleration in many of the colonies do also spur immigration to North America from places outside of England and outside of Great Britain. In Central and Eastern Europe, in the 17th century, there are numerous religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, and sometimes Catholics, and the Ottoman Turks get involved in there a little bit. It's really complex. But many people are looking for religious freedom, are looking for places where they can practice their faiths without persecution, and they begin to migrate across the Atlantic Ocean to some of the British colonies. One of the groups that makes its way from Central Europe to North America are the Mennonites, and kind of the breakaway group from the Mennonites, the Amish. They come from a Central European Germanic background. There's a blending of different Protestant ideas in both of these groups. They make their way to North America and settle in places like Western Pennsylvania, where many of them still remain. Another group that comes to North America during this period of religious revival are the Moravians. The Moravians begin arriving in North America in the 1730s, but by the 1740s, they have established a couple of settlements in Pennsylvania, places like Bethlehem and Nazareth, and eventually a large group of Moravians settle in North Carolina in the 1750s and 1760s. These are, in fact, from Old Salem in North Carolina. I would say Winston-Salem, North Carolina, an important Moravian settlement there. So again, another group coming to North America to practice their religion freely. And then by the time we get to the eve of the American Revolution, we see the Shakers arriving in large numbers in North America. The Shakers, the Shaker religion, formerly the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, it's kind of a mouthful, so we call them the Shakers, develop in England around the 1740s. And they are an offshoot of the Quakers. They kind of emerge out of the faith of the Quakers. They are seen as even more nonconformist than the Quakers. And part of it had to do with their religious ceremonies. What happens in a Shaker religious meeting? There's shaking. There is ritualized dancing that occurs. We see demonstrated here. This actually is a 19th century image, but it depicts the Shakers. By the time we get to the eve of the Revolution, 1774, Shakers are arriving in North America, and Shaker settlements are being established. Now, they reach their peak of popularity in North America in the middle of the 1800s. And there are Shaker settlements set up in western Massachusetts, in Vermont, in New Hampshire, in New York, and even down in Pennsylvania. Some of those are still in existence. But the Shakers are never really numerous. And part of it had to do with one of their beliefs. The Shakers were celibate. And it made it difficult to kind of maintain your numbers. How does the Shaker religion grow? Well, oftentimes through adoption. Young children would be adopted into the Shaker families, into Shaker communities, and when they reach the age of consent, they would be asked whether they wanted to join the religion or not. If they didn't, then they could leave. If they wanted to, then they would stay and undertake the vows of celibacy and participate in the religious ceremonies. There are still Shakers around today in the 21st century. They are not very numerous. I think there's about 3 left in North America. One of the beliefs of the Shakers was that they practiced communal living. They all lived together, worked together, shared their stuff. They were celibate, obviously. They were pacifists. And there was, in general, gender and racial equality among the Shakers, similar to the Quakers in many regards. So what does all of this really mean? All of these different groups, all of these different colonies established for different reasons? Well, it means that by the time we get to the American Revolution, there was significant religious diversity in the British colonies. And again, Christian religious diversity, different Christian groups. You can see the major groups here depicted by these various colors: the Anglicans, the Congregationalists, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians. But then you also had Baptists, Roman Catholics, Jewish populations in Newport and New York. Other Reformed churches scattered throughout the colonies. It meant that there were lots of people from lots of different faiths. And this is important when we talk about the founding of the United States, because if we were to go to Philadelphia in 1776 and be in that room in Carpenter's Hall when they are debating the issue of independence from Britain, the men in that room were a religiously diverse group. You had Congregationalists or Protestant Puritans. You had Anglicans, Presbyterians, Quakers, Deists. Deism is kind of a philosophy more than a outright religion. There were Catholics and there were Unitarians in that group. So there was relative religious diversity among this group of really non-diverse group that we see in the image right here. And this is all significant because once we've gained our independence from Britain and we set about to govern ourselves, we draft a constitution in 1787. And in 1791, a series of amendments are added to that Constitution. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. And what is the first amendment added to the Constitution all about? The first thing that the Bill of Rights does is it guarantees the freedom of religion. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The idea of religious freedom that is enshrined in the Constitution comes out of the long experience of religious diversity, religious conflict, religious struggle in North America, in the English colonies, and in Europe. In England and in other parts of Europe where people were fleeing persecution, looking for a place to practice their religion freely. Now, as I said at the beginning, much of this is Christian religion. We are talking about different sects of Christianity, but there were Jewish populations in North America. There were certainly native religions in North America that I don't even discuss, a tremendous diversity among the Native American religions. And there were even people who practiced Islam in North America. Now, many of those people that practiced Islam were enslaved. They were held in bondage. So their freedom to practice their faith was tremendously limited. But it was a part of the early American discussion of religion that it does eventually lead us to this moment of the First Amendment. And that, mercifully, is the end of my talk. Does anybody have any questions? I was apparently a little bit long-winded because I'm looking over here at the clock and I went past my time.
I'm curious about Roger Williams.
Roger Williams, yes.
How'd that come about? Did he ask for it?
For the charter?
Yeah, the charter.
The charter was a document that guaranteed your legal status. And usually the colonial leaders do request from the king having a charter granted. I don't know if Roger Williams was the one who directly was involved with granting the charter, because that was 30 years after he established the colony, but it certainly contains many of the ideas that were part of the foundation of Providence and of Rhode Island. Now, what's interesting is that in the 17th century, England goes through a period of political turmoil. You have the English Civil War in the 1640s, which leads to the execution of Charles I. And a period called the Interregnum, or the Commonwealth, where Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans have control of England. During that period, Puritan migration to North America dries up because they're not fleeing from anybody anymore. You have lots of Anglicans, however, that show up in Virginia, the Cavaliers. But in 1660, the monarchy is restored. Charles II becomes the king, and Charles II starts reissuing a lot of the charters, or formalizing a lot of the charters that had kind of been assumed earlier. So a lot of the colonies get their charters during the reign of Charles II.
I have a question about Jamestown.
Yes.
Was that a religious?
Jamestown was a financial venture. It was set up as a business enterprise to make money. The English had seen the Spanish and the French and the Dutch profiting from their contact with the Americas, and the English wanted to kind of get in on that. So if you look at the first settlers at Jamestown, they were all men who were there to establish kind of a hold to figure out how to make a profit. Many of them don't survive that first year. Jamestown has a tough time at the beginning. And Jamestown, for the most part, isn't really that successful until the English figure out how to hybridize various strains of tobacco. And they start shipping tobacco to England. And of course, everybody in England starts smoking tobacco and they get addicted to it and they want more and more and more. And that spurs the growth of Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay by generating tremendous profit. So Virginia starts off as a business enterprise by and large.
Well, I was reading the book, The Mayflower, and it tells that they needed money to get here. So they were dependent on the people that set them up with the money, and they were supposed to pay it back.
Right. There were investors that helped send the separatists, the Pilgrims, to North America. There was an economic aspect to that too. There was a hope that wherever the Pilgrims landed, they would be able to generate a profit. Of course, they were supposed to go to Virginia too. They ended up in Plymouth. So the profitability of Plymouth probably wasn't what the investors had hoped. But there always had to be that kind of financial backing for that sort of endeavor.
You had talked about the Puritans that went down to the islands to Barbados, and they became rum runners or involved in rum. Did they thrive down there, and how was it they?
Slavery.
How was it that they're making rum, selling rum? Aren't the Puritans?
Oh, the Puritans drank.
Yeah.
The Puritans were not, again, the image we have of Puritans today, that they're all dressed in black and never had any fun, is completely ahistorical. It's not accurate at all. Puritans, they drank a lot. And part of that is because in England it was safer to drink alcohol than it was to drink the water. At least, alcohol killed whatever was in the water, and to make alcoholic beverages you have to boil the water. So it was better to drink, a pint of cider than a pint of water from the Thames. But alcohol was not forbidden. Now, excessive use of alcohol was scorned, but everybody drank. Children, the elderly, they drank many, many pints a day because it was considered healthful, it was considered natural, and it was, as I said, safer than drinking the water.
Were the slaves actually brought over in the 1600s?
The first enslaved Africans arrive at Jamestown in 1619. They are carried over on a Dutch ship. The Dutch show up with this cargo of enslaved Africans. It was 24 of them or so. And the English purchase the slaves and see an opportunity. And that really begins the development of the slave system in English North America. Now, slaves had been used in other parts of the Americas for more than a century at that point. The Spanish and the Portuguese in South America, the islands of the Caribbean had large populations of enslaved peoples working on the extractive industries, the mining, the sugar plantations and that sort of thing. But the arrival of slaves in English North America does begin in 1619 at Jamestown. And it's important to remember that oftentimes when we think of slavery, we think of it only as being in the South, but it was in all the colonies. There were enslaved peoples in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in New Hampshire. Much of the wealth of colonial Newport derives from the transatlantic slave trade. The Brown family that establishes Brown University, there were 5 Brown brothers, I think, and 3 of them were very heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade. 2 of them were Quakers. So family dinners must have been interesting in that household. But a lot of the Brown money came from the African slave trade.